Welcome to Revenge Flame. Today we're heading over to Maine for a story. Standing amidst the swirling gray mist of Portland, with my clothes torn and my body aching from the violent impact, I watched the warm light of the mansion flicker against the cold glass of the window. I am Deanna, a 32-year-old book restorer who nearly became a fading memory on a jagged cliffside just an hour ago, while the metallic scent of smoke still clung to my hair. The sound emanating from the living room was not one of mourning, but of a wild, champagne-fueled celebration as my older sister Priscilla clutched a glass with a manic grin while staring at the television report that mistakenly confirmed my demise. I watched in frozen horror as she turned toward the shadows and screamed with a joy that pierced my soul. "Call the lawyer. Finally, this house will belong to us and we never have to deal with her again." The betrayal felt sharper than any shard of glass from my shattered SUV, because the very person I shared my childhood with was now dancing upon my supposed grave. My heart hammered against my ribs while I realized that the life I had built was being dismantled by greed before my body was even cold. I stood paralyzed in the freezing darkness as my brother-in-law Franklin began clinking his glass against hers, while laughing about how they would finally clear their mounting debts with my life insurance payout. The cold realization that my own flesh and blood had orchestrated my disappearance chilled me far more than the Maine winter ever could, and I knew that my return would be the beginning of their reckoning. But before I show you how I turned their premature celebration into their worst nightmare, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your support allows me to share these incredible stories of justice and resilience with the world. Also, let me know in the comments which city you are watching from today. Now let us continue with the moment I decided to step out of the shadows. The shadows of the porch offered me a cold sanctuary while I pressed my back against the damp cedar planks to listen to the monsters hiding inside my own home. My sister Priscilla was pacing across the hardwood floor with a sharp clacking of her heels that sounded like a predator marking its new territory. I heard her voice dripping with an icy greed as she instructed my brother-in-law Franklin to contact a locksmith first thing in the morning to change every single bolt on our heavy oak doors. She laughed while claiming that she couldn't wait to see the curb lined with black industrial trash bags filled with my vintage cardigans and those dusty leather-bound books that I had spent my entire life preserving. Priscilla sneered at the thought of my restoration studio, calling it a pathetic waste of space that would soon be transformed into a sun-drenched breakfast nook for her morning mimosas. Franklin let out a low, gravelly chuckle while he poured himself another generous glass of our father's expensive scotch, as if he had already earned the right to deplete the cellar. He began muttering about the mounting pressure from the bookies at the local casino and how this life insurance payout was a divine miracle that would finally erase his gambling debts. I could almost hear the scratching of his pen on a napkin while he calculated the interest he owed to the shadows of Portland's underground. He promised Priscilla that once the creditors were satisfied, the remaining hundreds of thousands of dollars would be hers to spend on the designer handbags and silk dresses she always felt the world owed her. Franklin's tone was devoid of any remorse when he mentioned that my disappearance was the most profitable thing I had ever done for this family. He spoke about my existence as if it were a clerical error that had finally been corrected by a fortunate twist of fate on a rainy cliffside. My sister began rummaging through the antique china cabinet because the delicate porcelain clinking under her clumsy fingers sounded like she was searching for anything of immediate resale value. She mocked my devotion to our parents' memory, claiming that I was a fool for staying behind to care for them while she was out experiencing the real world. Priscilla told Franklin that the house would look much better once they stripped away the history and turned it into a high-end vacation rental for wealthy tourists. They planned to sell the silver tea sets and the hand-woven rugs that Mom had cherished for decades, treating our family legacy like a bargain bin at a local flea market. Franklin agreed that the sentimental value was a burden they no longer had to carry, now that I was out of the picture for good. He mentioned that he had already looked up the market value of our neighborhood and was thrilled by the skyrocketing prices of waterfront properties in Maine. The air grew thinner around me as I listened to them divide the spoils of my life with the cold efficiency of a pair of vultures stripping a carcass. Priscilla expressed a twisted relief that she would never have to listen to my lectures about family tradition or the importance of keeping our heritage intact. She seemed obsessed with the idea of a fresh start, one built upon the foundation of my tragic end and funded by the blood money of a fraudulent insurance claim. Franklin assured her that the paperwork for the policy was already in motion and that his connections would ensure the process was expedited without too many uncomfortable questions. He bragged about how easy it had been to convince the agents of my supposed frailty and the inherent risks of my frequent solo drives along the coast. Every word they spoke was a fresh stab to my heart, yet it also forged a steel-cold resolve within my soul that surpassed any pain I felt from the crash. "We should throw an even bigger gala next weekend to officially debut the new estate owner," Priscilla suggested while clinking her glass against the decanter in a celebratory toast. Franklin grinned and replied that he had already scouted a luxury yacht rental for their victory cruise once the first installment of the payout hit their shared bank account. I watched through a sliver in the curtains as they toasted to their new beginning, their faces distorted by a grotesque joy that I didn't recognize as human. They were already discussing which walls to tear down and which of my personal belongings were worthless enough to be hauled away by the afternoon pickup. Priscilla's laughter echoed through the hallway where I used to play as a child, but now it sounded like a funeral dirge for the sisterhood I thought we shared. They were so blinded by the glint of potential riches that they never once stopped to wonder if the news report had told the whole truth about that mangled SUV. My sister's greed had finally stripped away the mask of familial love to reveal the hollow, rotting core of her true intentions toward me and our home. I stood there in the dark, a living ghost witnessing the death of my past while my future began to sharpen into a weapon of absolute justice. At the time the sun began to dip behind the jagged cliffs of the Maine coast that day, I had absolutely no reason to suspect that I was driving straight into a sophisticated death trap designed by the people I loved most. My memory drifted back to the chaotic scene in our living room just a few hours prior, where Priscilla was writhing on the velvet sofa while clutching her stomach in a theatrical display of agony that would have convinced even the most skeptical doctor. She looked up at me with tear-filled eyes that were wide with panic and begged me to drive into town to pick up a specialized prescription that she claimed was the only thing that could stop her excruciating cramps. I hesitated because the weather was turning foul, but Franklin immediately stepped in to block my view of her with a look of immense concern plastered across his face. He insisted that he needed to stay behind to monitor her vitals and prepare the guest room for her recovery, creating a perfect excuse to isolate me in the vehicle. I remember grabbing my keys with trembling hands because I genuinely believed my sister was in the throes of a medical emergency that required my immediate action. Franklin practically pushed me out the door while glancing nervously at his watch, as if he were timing something far more sinister than a pharmacy run. He leaned into the driver's side window before I pulled away and gave me a directive that now echoes in my mind with a chilling clarity. "Don't waste any time checking the mirrors or adjusting the seat. Deanna, just go as fast as you can before she passes out from the pain." I sped out of the driveway with my heart pounding in my chest, completely unaware that a delivery van from the most expensive caterer in Portland was pulling in through the back gate just moments after I disappeared around the bend. My sister and her husband were not preparing for a hospital visit as they had claimed, but were instead ordering cases of vintage champagne and trays of gourmet hors d'oeuvres to celebrate the solitude they would soon enjoy. They had orchestrated a timeline where my tragic accident would coincide perfectly with the arrival of their party supplies, so they could toast to their newfound wealth over my fresh corpse. I navigated the winding asphalt of the coastal highway with a sense of urgency because the mist was thickening and the road was becoming slicker with every passing mile. The drive was uneventful until I reached the notorious curve near Cape Elizabeth, where the guardrails are sparse and the drop into the Atlantic Ocean is a sheer vertical plunge. I pressed my foot against the brake pedal to slow down for the turn, but instead of the reassuring resistance of hydraulics, my foot slammed all the way to the floorboard without any effect. A surge of pure adrenaline flooded my system as I pumped the pedal repeatedly, while the speedometer continued to climb higher despite my desperate attempts to regain control. The steering wheel shuddered violently in my hands as the heavy SUV gathered momentum on the downhill slope and hurtled toward the edge of the cliff like a guided missile. I realized in that split second of terror that Franklin's earlier maintenance check in the garage had actually been a calculated sabotage to sever the brake lines. "Please God, not like this. I don't want to die." I screamed into the empty cabin just before the front tires left the pavement, and the world turned into a spinning kaleidoscope of gray sky and dark water. The impact was a deafening crunch of metal and shattering glass that knocked the breath from my lungs and sent the vehicle tumbling down the rocky embankment. I lost consciousness for an unknown amount of time until the freezing spray of the ocean against my face shocked me back into a painful reality. I found myself thrown clear of the wreckage and tangled in a dense thicket of scrub bushes that had miraculously broken my fall before I hit the jagged rocks below. The burning wreckage of my SUV was partially submerged in the surf 100 feet down, sending plumes of black smoke into the twilight air. I tried to move my limbs and cried out in pain, but a rough hand suddenly clamped over my shoulder to keep me steady. A weather-beaten fisherman who had been checking his lobster traps nearby had witnessed the crash and scrambled down the dangerous slope to pull me to safety. He looked at me with eyes full of shock and told me that he had seen the car fly off the edge as if it had no intention of stopping. I stared up at him through my matted hair and realized that calling an ambulance would alert the police, and alerting the police would alert Priscilla before I knew the full truth. I grabbed the stranger's arm with a desperate strength and begged him to help me get back to the main road without drawing any attention. "You are lucky to be alive, miss, because nobody survives a fall from Dead Man's Curve without a guardian angel watching over them." The fisherman helped me limp toward the highway where I eventually flagged down a passing taxi, leaving the burning evidence of Franklin's handiwork behind me in the ocean. I needed to see their faces when they realized their plan had failed, and that desire for confrontation fueled every painful step I took back toward my house. The physical agony of my bruises was nothing compared to the fiery rage that was now consuming my heart as the taxi carried me closer to the celebration I was never meant to attend. Just 10 minutes after the jubilant laughter inside the living room began to spiral out of control, I decided that the time for hiding in the shadows was over. I reached out with a trembling hand to turn the cold brass knob of the front door while bracing myself for the storm that was about to erupt within those walls. The heavy door swung open with a deliberate slowness to reveal Priscilla standing in the center of the foyer under the crystal chandelier. She was draping my mother's vintage sapphire necklace around her throat with a look of triumphant vanity that made my stomach churn with nausea. This was the specific piece of jewelry I had locked away in the master bedroom safe, which meant she had forcibly pried the lock open mere moments after the news report confirmed my death. She was so engrossed in admiring her reflection in the hallway mirror that she didn't even notice the muddy figure standing in the open doorway behind her. My best friend Sarah suddenly came sprinting up the driveway behind me with her coat soaked from the rain and her face pale with grief because she had heard the terrible news on the radio. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me standing there alive, but her relief was instantly replaced by a wave of confusion as she looked past my shoulder into the house. The sight that greeted us was not a home in mourning, but a lavish party scene, featuring open bottles of expensive champagne and upbeat jazz music playing from the stereo system. Sarah gasped audibly as the realization hit her that the people who should have been grieving were actually celebrating my demise with a festive enthusiasm. Her presence at that exact moment was a stroke of divine intervention because it provided me with an impartial witness to the moral bankruptcy of my own family. Priscilla finally saw my reflection in the mirror and spun around so quickly that the wine glass in her hand slipped from her fingers. The crystal goblet shattered against the marble floor with a sharp crash that silenced the music and sent shards of glass scattering across the room like broken diamonds. Franklin stumbled out from the kitchen with a half-eaten lobster tail in his hand and froze in his tracks when his eyes locked onto my battered form. The color drained from his face until he looked like a wax statue, while his mouth hung open in a silent scream of disbelief. I stepped across the threshold into the light to let them see the dirt on my face and the rips in my clothes that proved I had crawled out of the grave they dug for me. I see you didn't waste a single moment mourning my death before looting my jewelry box and drinking my best wine, Priscilla. My sister let out a strangled noise that sounded like a suffocating animal while she frantically tried to unclasp the sapphire necklace as if it were suddenly burning her skin. Sarah stepped into the room beside me with a look of pure disgust directed at the couple who were now trembling in the center of their failed victory party. She demanded to know why there were streamers on the mantel and jazz music playing when they had told her over the phone that they were too devastated to speak. Franklin tried to stammer out an excuse about drowning their sorrows, but the lie died on his lips when I held up the brochure for the luxury yacht rental I had found in the recycling bin outside. I walked further into the room until I was standing face to face with the man who had tampered with my car just hours before. I stared directly into Franklin's shifting eyes and asked him with a deadly calm voice about the life insurance policy he had taken out on me last week, without my consent. His aggression flared up instantly as a defense mechanism because he realized that his carefully constructed house of cards was collapsing in front of an outsider. He took a threatening step toward me with his fists clenched at his sides as if he intended to finish the job that the cliffside crash had failed to accomplish. Sarah immediately moved to shield me while pulling out her cell phone to dial the emergency number if he dared to make another move. Franklin roared that I was trespassing on property that legally belonged to them now, and that I had no right to question how they chose to handle their grief. You were supposed to be dead at the bottom of the Atlantic, so who are you to come back here and ruin everything we worked for? His confession hung in the air like a toxic cloud, while Priscilla grabbed his arm to silence him before he could incriminate them any further in front of a witness. I looked at the two of them with a cold detachment and told them that the only thing they had inherited tonight was a prison sentence. The fear in their eyes shifted into a desperate panic when they realized that Sarah had heard everything and that I was not the helpless victim they had sent over the cliff. When the night had fully descended, the living room of my parents now transformed into a suffocating legal battlefield where the air was thick with the scent of betrayal and stale champagne. Priscilla recovered from her initial shock with a terrifying speed because she reached into her designer handbag to withdraw a crisp leather portfolio that she slammed onto the coffee table with a resounding thud. She pulled out a document that appeared to have the shaky signatures of Mom and Dad at the bottom and claimed that this was the true last testament which superseded any previous arrangements regarding the estate. Her narcissism was so profound that she actually pushed a transfer deed toward me and demanded that I sign it immediately to compensate them for the severe emotional distress they had suffered during the last 2 hours of mourning. She looked at me with eyes that were devoid of empathy and insisted that my survival had caused a significant disruption to their financial planning, which required an immediate asset transfer to rectify. I looked down at the forgery with a mix of pity and disgust because I knew that my parents had anticipated her greed long before they passed away from their illnesses. I told her that those papers were nothing more than expensive kindling because the entire estate had been placed into an irrevocable trust 5 years ago, with me designated as the sole trustee to protect the family legacy. The color drained from her face when I explained that the trust was designed specifically to prevent the property from ever being touched by creditors or divided by disgruntled relatives regardless of any subsequent wills. I watched her hands tremble as the reality set in that her forged documents were completely powerless against the ironclad legal fortress my father had built. I then turned my attention to Franklin to deliver the second blow regarding the mechanical sabotage that had nearly ended my life on the cliffside. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the fresh grease stains on the garage floor where you lay to tamper with my brake lines this afternoon, Franklin? The accusation hung in the room like a heavy fog until the unity between the two conspirators began to fracture under the weight of their own incompetence and fear. Priscilla whipped her head around to glare at her husband with a venomous intensity because he had assured her that the accident would look completely natural and leave no physical evidence behind. Franklin stammered that he had been careful to wipe everything down, but his shifting eyes betrayed the truth that he was a desperate gambler who had taken a sloppy shortcut to pay off his debts. They began to argue right in front of us, with Priscilla accusing him of being a useless amateur who couldn't even execute a simple mechanical failure properly. Franklin retaliated by shouting that he never would have touched the car if she hadn't pressured him daily about needing money for her social club memberships and luxury vacations. The sight of them tearing each other apart was a grim validation of everything I had suspected about their toxic marriage and their motives. I stepped forward to snatch the fraudulent will from the table before Priscilla could destroy it, because I knew it would serve as a critical piece of evidence for the impending police investigation. I pointed a shaking finger toward the open door and ordered them to leave my house immediately before I forcibly removed them myself with the help of the authorities. The realization that they had lost everything, the house, the insurance money, and their freedom, caused Franklin to snap into a violent rage born of pure desperation. He lunged toward me with his hands reaching for my throat because he saw me as the only obstacle standing between him and his survival in that moment. Sarah reacted with the reflexes of a guardian angel by raising her smartphone directly in his face, with the camera light blinding him instantly. Go ahead and strike her, Franklin, because 5,000 people are currently watching this live stream on my social media feed and recording every move you make. He froze midair like a gargoyle because the threat of immediate public exposure was the one thing his fragile ego could not withstand. He looked at the phone screen where the comments were scrolling by in a rapid blur of outrage and slowly lowered his hands in defeat while backing away from the lens. Sarah kept the camera steady on his face while reminding him that the entire city of Portland was now witnessing the true nature of the grieving brother-in-law. I stood beside her with the forged will clutched tight against my chest and felt the adrenaline coursing through my veins as I watched the two of them shrink under the gaze of the digital witness. They were no longer the powerful relatives who could bully me into submission, but rather two caught criminals who were desperately looking for an exit from the stage they had built. In the early morning of the next day, as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the thick fog at the police headquarters, the atmosphere inside the interrogation room was heavy with the sterile scent of cold coffee and impending justice. I sat across the metal table from Detective Burke, while my best friend Sarah nervously tapped her fingers against her ceramic mug as we waited for the final pieces of the investigation to fall into place. The detective walked into the room carrying a thick manila folder that contained the forensic analysis of my wrecked SUV, which had been hauled up from the shoreline just hours before. He laid a high-resolution photograph on the table that showed a close-up of the brake line, which had been severed with a chillingly clean precision. Detective Burke explained in a grave tone that the mechanic confirmed the cut was made by a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters rather than any natural wear and tear from the road. The image of that severed cable sent a fresh wave of nausea through my stomach because it was the physical manifestation of my brother-in-law's desire to see me dead. Detective Burke then turned his attention to the digital footprint that Franklin had carelessly left behind in his desperate haste to secure his financial freedom. The cybercrime unit had obtained a warrant to access the router logs from my estate and discovered a series of incriminating search queries made from Franklin's personal laptop just 2 days prior to the crash. The detective read the search terms aloud, which included specific instructions on how to disable the hydraulic braking system of a late-model SUV without triggering the dashboard warning sensors immediately. I listened to the list of search results with a growing sense of horror because it proved that this was not a crime of passion, but a calculated execution planned over morning coffee. Franklin had studied how to kill me with the same casual interest one might use to look up a recipe for dinner, and that level of premeditation was enough to upgrade the charges significantly. We then moved on to the physical evidence of the financial motive which I had managed to salvage from the chaos of the living room confrontation the night before. I handed over the leather portfolio I had snatched from the coffee table, which contained not only the forged will, but also a life insurance policy hidden in the back pocket. Detective Burke put on a pair of latex gloves to examine the document that Priscilla had kept hidden in her desk until she thought I was gone for good. The policy was dated just 1 week ago and featured a signature that was a clumsy imitation of my own handwriting, which she likely practiced while I was out working in the studio. Sarah leaned over to point out that the beneficiary listed was solely Priscilla, with a payout clause that triggered double indemnity in the event of an accidental vehicular death. The paper trail was undeniable proof that my sister had placed a price tag on my head that was worth exactly $2 million. Sarah then provided her official witness statement regarding the surreal scene she had walked into when she arrived at the mansion to offer her condolences. She described in vivid detail how the jazz music was playing and how the champagne corks were popping at the exact moment the news reported a fatal accident involving my car. Her testimony was crucial because it established the mens rea, or the guilty mind of the perpetrators who were celebrating a tragedy rather than grieving a loss. Detective Burke noted every word carefully because Sarah's account destroyed any potential defense they might conjure about being in a state of shock or confusion. The combination of the severed brakes, the digital search history, the forged insurance, and the celebration created a fortress of evidence that no lawyer could breach. However, Detective Burke wanted to ensure that the attempted murder charge would stick without any possibility of a plea deal, so he proposed a psychological trap to secure a verbal confession. He instructed me to place a controlled call to the landline at the mansion, where Franklin and Priscilla were undoubtedly panic-stricken and waiting for their inevitable arrest. The plan was for me to feign a moment of hesitation and offer them a chance to settle this family matter privately if they would just admit to the tampering so I could fix the car for insurance purposes. I took a deep breath to steady my shaking hands before dialing the number that used to represent home, but now felt like a direct line to a snake pit. The detective signaled the recording technician to start the tape as the phone began to ring on the other end of the line. I needed them to say the words out loud to admit that they held the knife, so that the world would know exactly what kind of monsters were hiding behind the masks of my family. The afternoon silence of the coastal neighborhood was suddenly shattered by the wailing chorus of police sirens that echoed off the cliffs, like a judgment coming to collect a debt. I stood by the stone pillar of the front gate alongside Detective Burke, while a convoy of marked cruisers swarmed the curved driveway to block any potential escape route for the criminals hiding inside. The flashing blue and red lights painted the gray stone of the mansion in a chaotic rhythm that signaled the violent end of Priscilla's short-lived reign over our family estate. Detective Burke wasted no time in breaching the heavy oak doors that Priscilla had been so eager to rekey just the night before, because he led a team of uniformed officers directly into the heart of the conspiracy. We found them in the main hallway, surrounded by open suitcases filled with cash and jewelry, as they were frantically attempting to flee the jurisdiction before the inevitable legal hammer fell upon them. Franklin dropped a heavy stack of silver bullion he had looted from the wall safe when he saw the officers flooding into the space with their service weapons drawn and ready. The look of arrogant confidence that had defined his face for years instantly crumbled into a mask of pure terror as Detective Burke announced in a booming voice that they were under arrest for attempted first-degree murder and insurance fraud. The realization that there was no way out caused Franklin to completely lose his composure and turn against his wife with the desperate instinct of a cornered rat. He fell to his knees on the marble floor, with his hands raised in surrender, while pointing a shaking finger at Priscilla, who was standing frozen by the staircase. It was all her idea because she threatened to leave me if I didn't help her get the money to pay off the gambling debts. Franklin screamed while tears of cowardice streamed down his face. She told me exactly which wire to cut, and said that nobody would ever miss her sister anyway. Priscilla let out a piercing shriek of rage as the officers grabbed her arms to pull her away from the suitcase of stolen heirlooms she was clutching to her chest like a lifeline. She began kicking and screaming like a wild animal while denying every accusation with a delusion that was terrifying to witness given the mountain of evidence against her. Priscilla shouted that she was the rightful heir to the estate, and that I was the one who had manipulated the situation to frame them out of petty jealousy. The officers showed no sympathy as they forced her wrists behind her back and snapped the cold steel handcuffs shut with a definitive click that echoed through the silent house. "You cannot do this to me because I am a victim of this incompetent man who ruined everything," Priscilla yelled, while trying to spit on her husband who was now sobbing uncontrollably on the floor. "I wanted a divorce and a vacation, not a murder charge." I watched the spectacle from the doorway with a cold detachment that surprised even me because I felt absolutely nothing for the woman who had shared my childhood bedroom. The bond of sisterhood that I had tried so desperately to preserve had been severed not by the arrest, but by the moment she chose to celebrate my death instead of mourning it. Detective Burke hauled Franklin to his feet and dragged him past me, but my brother-in-law couldn't even look me in the eye as he was marched toward the exit. Priscilla, however, locked eyes with me as she was shoved forward by two female officers, and for a brief second I saw the true depth of her hatred. "This isn't over, Deanna, because you will never be happy in this house without us to guide you," she hissed through her gritted teeth before being forced out into the unforgiving daylight. I followed them out onto the porch where a crowd of reporters and curious neighbors had gathered behind the police tape to witness the downfall of the prominent couple. The local news cameras captured every moment of their humiliation as they were shoved into the back of separate squad cars while the community watched in stunned silence. The broadcast that Priscilla had watched with such joy the night before was now being replaced by a live feed of her own arrest for the attempted murder of her sister. I stood on the top step of the porch and crossed my arms while watching the red taillights of the police cars fade into the distance down the coastal road. The driveway was finally empty and the sirens had faded into silence, so the vultures that had circled my life were finally caged. More than a year has passed since the physical scars of the accident and the emotional wounds of the betrayal began to finally close. The courtroom was absolutely silent when the judge delivered the final verdict that sealed the fate of the two people who had once shared my holiday dinners and claimed to love me. Priscilla received a sentence of 25 years in a federal penitentiary for attempted first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud because she was identified as the mastermind behind the entire operation. Franklin was sentenced to 20 years with no possibility of parole for his role in the physical sabotage of the vehicle and his willing participation in the financial scheme. I watched them being led away in shackles without feeling a single ounce of guilt because they had made their choices the moment they decided my life was worth less than a luxury renovation. I spent the following months systematically dismantling the life I had built in that coastal mansion because every room was now tainted by the memory of their greed and their callous laughter. I hired a specialized estate liquidator to auction off the furniture and the art collection that Priscilla had been so eager to sell for pennies on the dollar just moments after my crash. The house itself was sold to a lovely young family who had no connection to our history and could fill those hallways with genuine laughter instead of the toxic ambition that had poisoned my sister. I took the proceeds from the sale along with the contents of the family trust and moved to a quiet town in the mountains of Vermont where nobody knew my name or my story. The separation from my former family was absolute because I made a vow to never let their toxicity touch my life again, regardless of how much time passed. I received several letters from the prison during the first few months that were marked with the penitentiary stamp and addressed in Priscilla's frantic handwriting. I never opened a single one of them because I knew they would only contain manipulation or hollow apologies designed to serve her own interests. I tossed them directly into the fireplace of my new cottage and watched the paper turn to ash in the same way she had tried to burn my existence for a payout. Franklin attempted to reach out through his lawyer to request a character reference for an appeal hearing, but I instructed my legal team to block all future communications permanently. I decided to honor the memory of Mom and Dad by using the inheritance to establish a charitable foundation dedicated to helping victims of domestic betrayal and financial abuse. It felt incredibly healing to turn the money that Priscilla had tried to kill for into a resource that could save others from experiencing the same darkness I had endured. I returned to my work as a book restorer in a small studio downtown, where I found peace in the quiet meticulousness of saving history rather than fighting over it. I built a new circle of friends who were chosen based on the sincerity of their hearts, rather than the obligation of bloodlines. Sarah remained my closest confidant throughout the entire transition because she was the one person who stood by me when the world was falling apart. I often sit on my back porch watching the sunset behind the mountains while realizing that I am finally breathing air that is free from the weight of expectation and fear. The nightmare on the cliffside took away my car and my innocence, but it gave me back a life that is entirely my own and completely authentic. I survived the crash, and I survived the heartbreak to become a woman who knows exactly what she is worth and refuses to settle for anything less than genuine love. The first and most painful lesson is that sharing DNA does not automatically guarantee loyalty or love because toxic behavior can often come from the people closest to us. We must learn to judge people by their actions rather than their titles, because a stranger can save your life, while a sister can plot your demise for financial gain. The second lesson is that greed is a blinding force that can strip away humanity and turn decent people into monsters who rationalize the unthinkable. We must guard our hearts against the obsession with material wealth because it often comes at the cost of our soul and our freedom. The final lesson is that we must always protect ourselves legally and financially, even from family members, because having safeguards like a trust or a will is not about mistrust, but about ensuring our wishes are respected. Thank you so much for accompanying me on this emotional journey of survival and justice against all odds. I truly appreciate every single one of you who stayed until the very end to witness the truth come to light. Please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments below about what you would have done in my situation, because I read every single one of them.